to start today by throwing a concept at you that frankly usually means an HR meeting is about to happen.
Oh, no.
It's a phrase that triggers this almost immediate eye roll from anyone who's already overwhelmed. Goal setting.
Oh, yeah. That is a loaded term.
Mm-hmm.
It usually comes with a huge side of guilt, doesn't it?
Oh, no.
Like, here's a brand new list of things you aren't doing, but you definitely should be.
Precisely. When we think goals, we think KPIs or, quarterly projections, or maybe if we're talking personal life training for a marathon.
Or learning French.
Yes, finally learning French. It feels like pressure. It feels like performance. But today we're looking at a source that takes this concept and drops it right into an environment where performance is the last thing on anyone's mind.
We're talking about caregiving.
We're doing a deep dive into Chapter 7 of the Christian Care Mentor. The chapter is called Setting Goals, Small Steps Toward Faithful Progress. And I know some listeners might be thinking, well, I'm not a caregiver. Does this apply to me? But having read through this, the psychology here, the way we function under extreme stress, it's universal.
It absolutely is. The text is, technically a manual for mentors, so people who are helping caregivers. But what it's really describing is how to function when you feel like you're drowning.
Okay, so let's start with the visual the source material gives us. It's a specific image meant to set the tone for the whole chapter. Can you describe what we're looking at?
Sure. It's a picture of a woman. She's sitting at a desk. She's wearing a hijab, looking at a laptop, clearly working. But the focal point, at least for the author, is that she's also holding a glass of juice. She looks calm.
It's a nice picture, but why does the text get so fixated on the juice?
Because the juice represents the tension of the whole chapter. The laptop is the output, the work, the logistics, all the care. But the juice is the input. It's the refreshment. And the source argues that sustainable goal setting isn't just about managing the laptop. It's about making sure the juice actually happens. It's about stewardship of yourself, not just stewardship of your tasks.
That distinction between stewardship and performance feels like the absolute linchpin here. Because if you tell an exhausted person they need to perform, they'll just break.
They will.
But the text opens by identifying the state most caregivers live in. It calls it reactive living.
And this is a critical concept. Reactive living is what happens when your life is dictated entirely by external demands. The phone rings, you answer. A patient falls, you help.
The prescription runs out, you're in the car.
Exactly.
It sounds like you're just playing defense for 16 hours a day.
It is. But the text alludes to something a bit deeper here, almost neurological. When you are in reactive mode, your brain is essentially locked in the amygdala, the fear center. You aren't planning. You aren't really even thinking in a complex way.
You're just deflecting blows.
You're just deflecting blows. So when we tell a caregiver in that state, or really anyone who's burnt out to set a goal, we're asking their prefrontal cortex to come online and do all this complex planning when it's offline.
Which is why it feels almost physically painful to think about the future when you're just trying to survive today.
Exactly. And that's why the text argues that agency, even tiny microscopic agency, is the antidote. It sort of forces the brain to sweat tracks from survive to decide.
The source actually brings in a theological anchor right here, citing Jeremiah 29.11. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you hope and a future. Now, play the skeptic with me for a second. If I'm changing bedpans, haven't slept in 2 days, and someone quotes that verse to me, I might snap. It can feel like such a platitude.
It really can, and the text acknowledges that risk. But the argument here is that the verse isn't being used to say, don't worry, be happy. It's used to remind the caregiver that their identity hasn't been suspended.
That the crisis isn't the whole story.
Right. It's an assertion that you still have a future, and you still have the right to make plans, even if those plans are incredibly small.
So to make this really concrete, the chapter introduces us to a case study, a man named Robert. And Robert is, he's struggling. Robert is the avatar for everyone listening who feels like they're failing. He's caring for a loved one. His schedule is packed from morning to night. But every single time he meets with his mentor, Ellen, he says, I feel like I should be doing more.
That phrase just haunts me. I should be doing more. The text calls this vague guilt.
And vague guilt is a very specific, very toxic fuel. It's that free-floating anxiety that you are failing, but you can't point to a specific task you missed.
It's just an atmosphere.
It's just a general atmosphere of not enough.
So Ellen, the mentor, she has to get him out of this vague guilt and into that proactive posture we talked about. But she doesn't just start listing solutions. The text introduces a framework here called the IGRO model. Right. This is adapted from the GRO model, which is pretty standard in business coaching goal reality options way forward. But for caregiving, they added an I at the beginning.
And the I stands for intro, which, sounds a bit like fluff. Hello, how are you? Why does the text even dedicate space to this?
Because of that amygdala issue we just mentioned. The I is the relational glue. You have to establish safety before you can do business. You review the previous week with care, not with judgment. If you skip the I and go straight to so what are your goals, you're treating the person like a project, not a human.
You trigger the defense mechanisms.
Instantly.
So Ellen sits down with Robert, she does the intro, she establishes safety, then she moves to G goal. But Robert's in a fog. He doesn't have a goal. He just has guilt.
And this is where Ellen's skill really comes in.
Yeah.
She asks a question that just cuts through all that fog. She asks, what would feel like a good outcome for today?
Not for the next 6 months.
No.
Just today.
Just for today. And Robert realizes he doesn't want to fix the illness. He doesn't want to clean the whole house. He admits, I just want to feel less overwhelmed.
That's the goal. Feel less overwhelmed. I mean, that sounds pretty abstract for a goal-setting session.
It starts abstract,
Yeah.
but that's the G. Then they move to our reality. They have to look at why he feels overwhelmed. And the reality was he was obsessing over a dozen things he couldn't control. But there was one logistical thing.
Okay.
Getting transportation for a medical appointment that was just eating up all his mental RAM.
Okay, so that's the reality. He's bottlenecked by this transportation issue. Now, O is options. And usually this is where a friend would jump in and say, oh, just call the shuttle service or just ask your neighbor.
And that is exactly what the text warns you not to do. That strips Robert of his agency.
Right.
If Ellen solves it, Robert is still a victim who needed rescuing. In the options phase, Ellen has to ask, what do you think you could do?
She forces him to do the thinking.
She acts as a mirror, not a mechanic. Robert has to be the one to realize, I could call the transport service.
And finally, would wrap up. They agree on the action.
Exactly. But before they even get to that agreement, there is this crucial rule the text mentions. It's called the look backward rule, or a strengths-based approach.
This part seemed a little counterintuitive to me. If I have a problem now, looking backward at the past seems like a waste of time. Why does the text insist on this?
Because you cannot build change on a foundation of shame.
Say more about that.
Well, if Robert is operating out of that vague guilt, he feels incompetent. And if he feels incompetent, he won't take action. He'll freeze. So the look backward rule asks the mentor to point out what the caregiver is already doing right. Robert, look at how you managed the medication last week. Look at the incredible patience you showed yesterday.
The text actually mentions naming the fruits of the spirit here: patience, kindness, faithfulness.
Yes. And even from a purely secular psychology perspective, this is bright spot analysis. You have to prove to the person's brain that they are capable of success by showing them hard evidence of past success. Only then do they get the confidence to say, okay, yeah, I can make that phone call.
So Robert decides to make the call. But here's where the goal-setting stigma usually creeps back in. We're taught that goals should be big. Shoot for the moon, right?
And the text says, absolutely not. In a crisis context, you shoot for the curb. You aim for the ground right beneath your feet.
And this leads us to the concept of the micro goal.
The micro goal. The thoughts and tips section of the chapter has a very strict rule. Start with goals that take less than 15 minutes.
Less than 15 or...
So if it takes an hour, it's too big. If it requires 3 different locations, it's too big. The example they give is so simple, it's almost laughable, but it's brilliant. A participant says, I'm exhausted, I need to get healthy.
Right. Get healthy is a life project, not a goal.
It's way too big. So the mentor drills it down. Do you want to join a gym? No time. Do you want to walk? Maybe. Okay, can you commit to one 15-minute walk this week?
Just one.
Just one. And usually the person just sighs with relief. I can do one?
And the text advises writing this down. It cites Habakkuk 2.2. Write down the revelation and make it plain. Again, taking ancient scripture and applying it to cognitive science.
It's the difference between a thought and a commitment, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
When Robert writes down, call transport service Tuesday, 9 a.m., it moves from his worried mind onto the paper. It stops swirling.
It becomes an object he can actually handle.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm with you on the theory, but let's do a reality check. We can set micro goals, we can have these great conversations, we can write it down on fancy paper. But life in a caregiving scenario or any high-stress job is just chaotic.
Hmm.
Robert intends to make the call, but then the patient gets sick, or the car breaks down, or he just gets depressed and sits on the couch. He fails.
And then the shame spiral starts all over again.
Right, so how does this method handle failure? Because if goal setting just gives me one more thing to fail at, I don't want it.
This is, I think, my favorite part of the chapter. It reframes failure completely. It explicitly states, missed goals are not failures. They are opportunities to adjust plans.
That sounds nice, but isn't that just letting people off the hook? I mean, if I don't do the thing, I didn't do the thing.
It's not about letting them off the hook, it's about keeping them in the game. The text cites Proverbs 24.16. For though the righteous fall 7 times, they rise again. The emphasis isn't on the falling, it's on the rising.
Okay.
And the rising requires curiosity, not judgment.
Curiosity versus judgment. What does that actually look like in a conversation?
Okay, let's do a quick failure autopsy.
Yeah?
Let's say you set that goal to walk for 15 minutes. You didn't do it. You come back to me, the mentor, feeling like a total loser. A judgmental response asks, why? Why didn't you walk? Didn't you say you wanted to get healthy?
Which instantly makes me defensive. I'll just start making excuses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But a curious response asks, what? What happened on Tuesday that got in the way?
Okay, well, on Tuesday it was raining and I couldn't find my sneakers, and honestly, I just felt too tired to even look for them.
Bingo. Now we have data. The barrier wasn't that you're a lazy person. The barrier was you didn't have your shoes ready and the weather was bad.
So the new goal isn't try harder.
No. The new goal is put your sneakers by the door on Monday night.
You solve for the logistics, not the character flaw.
Precisely. You adjust the goal to fit the reality. If 15 minutes was too long, you make it 5 minutes. If walking is too hard, you make it stretching. The goal serves the person doesn't serve the goal.
That brings us all the way back to Robert. He made his one phone call. It didn't cure his loved one. It didn't clear his schedule, but the text says it eased the load.
It moved him from vague guilt to intentional steps. He went from being a victim of his circumstances to being a steward of his time. And even if that step was tiny, the psychological shift was massive.
He realized he wasn't helpless.
He wasn't helpless. And that's the faithful progress in the title, you know. It's not about speed, it's about direction.
It really is. And thinking about our listeners, whether they're caregivers or students during finals week or parents with toddlers, this whole methodology holds up.
It really does.
Because we all have that vague guilt. We all have that list of things we should be doing.
And the solution isn't to beat yourself up for not doing the absolute maximum. It's to look at what you are doing, recognize your own strengths, and then set one tiny 15-minute goal that you can actually achieve today.
And write it down.
You know?
Write it down. As we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with a question that the text poses at the very end. It's a reflection question, but I think it cuts right to the core of everything we've just discussed.
It's a powerful one.
The question is this. In your own life, how often do you set goals that are driven by pressure versus goals that are led by spirit and grace?
That changes the whole equation, doesn't it?
Yeah. And if you dropped the pressure just for today, what would a good outcome actually look like for you? Not what would look good on Instagram or what your boss wants. What would make you feel like you stewarded this day well?
Just for today.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.